In this lesson, we'll focus on manipulating the overall shape of the mouth and creating the tongue. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so in the previous lesson, we focused on basically elongating the lower jaw, basically stretching it down a lot further. And in doing so, we also stretched the mouth a lot wider as well. And so as we continue to create and develop our photorealistic fantasy concept, we want to really push these different facial attributes into a realm that really doesn't feel as human, okay? And so what we're ready to do now is really start to focus on the mouth area. We eventually want to add some really jagged, nasty teeth, right? But before we can do that, we really need to fix all this stretched pixel information in the inside of the mouth. We need to basically build the tongue. Now, the tongue stretched pretty bad when we basically stretched the jaw down, and that was because we really didn't have a whole lot of information to work with as far as the tongue itself, just looking at our base head layer. So what we're going to do is first kind of clean up the overall shape of the mouth, kind of reposition it just a little bit more in Liquify, and then we'll come in here and we'll kind of just start to do a little bit of painting with our brush tool and just kind of resculpt the mouth and texture it as well. So we want to preserve the state in which our head has been manipulated thus far. So again, we're going to go ahead and right click on our jaw layer and we'll go to duplicate layer. And so for this layer, we'll just call it mouth. All right, so let's go ahead and go back into Liquify. And we'll go ahead and zoom in here. All right. And we're going to continue to use our forward warp tool. So with our forward warp tool, let's go ahead and size the brush tip down considerably. And we'll keep the brush density about halfway. All right. So we want to kind of focus on just kind of refining the overall shape of the mouth a little bit more. Again, we want to kind of have his mouth to appear just very aggressive, very open, and that's going to allow us to really show off some really nasty, ugly teeth. So right now, I'm just kind of coming around the edges and just kind of cleaning them up so they don't appear as wobbly, just from that previous manipulation that we performed with the jaw. I was still noticing that we had just a little bit of wobbliness in there. So I'm just kind of coming up here to the upper corners of the upper mouth. I'm kind of trying to flare them out just a little bit more. Now we'll go ahead and size our brush up just a little bit more. And we'll just kind of pull that lower mouth down just a hair more. Again, just opening that mouth up just a little bit more than we already did when we stretched the jaw downwards. So that's looking pretty nice. I'm kind of liking how that's looking. Let's go ahead and commit to those changes. All right. And now we want to come in and really kind of start to clean up all that stretched information on the inside of the mouth. So let's just grab our brush tool. And I'm just going to use a hard round brush. These are just the default brush presets that come equipped with Photoshop CS6. And we're going to go ahead and size up our brush. So at any time we can right click to bring up our brush preset picker that we have right here. So I'm just kind of hovering over the canvas to kind of decide on the size of my brush tip. Next thing we want to do is come over here to our brush panel. And we've got some different settings here in our brush panel. And we're just going to focus on using transfer for the time being. And within transfer, we can control the opacity and flow of the brush tip. And you'll notice we have controls for both opacity and flow. I'm going to set each one of these to pen pressure since I'm using a Wacom stylus. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom in here. And I'm just going to kind of sample by holding down Alt. It's going to bring up my eyedropper. May want to size my brush down a little bit more. And we're just going to start to reshape and repaint the tongue inside of his mouth, all right? And you'll find me kind of sampling quite a bit, just kind of from the surrounding areas as we build this tongue. So right now I'm just kind of sampling from all over, the tongue. We're just kind of trying to resculpt it, repaint it in his mouth. And so the reason we're focusing on the tongue first before the teeth, it just makes it a lot easier. I'd rather get the tongue worked in first because it's going to be sitting in behind some really nasty, jagged, vertical teeth that will be overlapping it. So I'm just kind of starting to get a feel for the overall shape as that tongue sits in his mouth. Periodically, it's a good idea, just kind of zoom out, just kind of see how that's shaping up. I'm also thinking about how much of the light hits this tongue as it recedes back into his mouth where it's just darker. So as I get kind of towards the area where it's receding back in his mouth, I'm kind of just sampling from some of those darker areas, just kind of painting them in, kind of blending them in. And again, this is why I have pressure sensitivity enabled for this brush tip. Being able to control the opacity and flow from our brush panel really helps me blend these colors together, these colors and these values together. All right, so we've got our tongue started to work in here. I'm liking how it's shaping up. So what we need to do now is really start to kind of add a little bit of texture to the tongue. It looks very flat, kind of out of place with the rest of the entire face, and that's because we don't have any texture. And so what we can do next is to kind of sample from some of the skin around his face and just kind of add that little bit of texture in there. So if you look at your tongue in the mirror, you're going to see all those little bumps, all those little taste buds. And so we want to kind of replicate that. And I'm just looking at his chin, and we have some very nice little just bumps right there, some little pores of the skin right there that we can basically pull into the tongue. And so to do this, we're going to grab, yet again, our healing brush tool. Okay? And so the healing brush tool basically allows us to match transparency, the lighting, and the texture. And so it's just a great tool, much more effective than just using the clone stamp tool. So I'm just kind of sampling from this area down here on his chin. And I'm just kind of starting to work that in over his tongue. You can kind of see how it starts to weave it in just right over. It preserves the overall color. And even as we get back there kind of in the darker areas, starting to just kind of get that texture over the tongue. And I kind of want to be careful. I noticed I was getting a little bit of that hair on the lower part of his lower lip, so we don't want to get that on his tongue. That would just kind of look a little bit confusing later on if we had some textures in there that shouldn't really normally be on a tongue. And so as we start to layer in more of these skin textures, I can kind of start to sample from within and just kind of mix them up even further so it doesn't look like so much of a repeated pattern. And that's often the case that can happen just cloning using any kind of healing or clone tool. All right, let's go ahead and kind of zoom out just really quick. And I'm liking how that's looking. I'm going to come back to my brush tool and just kind of start to weave this in a little bit better. So it's just kind of a combination of a little bit of painting, a little bit of texturing just for this tongue. All right, let's kind of zoom out here. I'm liking how that's looking. We're going to have a little bit of shadow just kind of down here in this lower area where that tongue kind of meets, kind of going down behind those teeth just a little bit. Go ahead and kind of resize our healing brush tool and just kind of starting to work those in. And I'm noticing I'm getting a little bit of the white from the teeth into the tongue. I don't really want that, so I can use my clone stamp tool in that case to kind of really refine those areas kind of right there by the teeth. Alrighty. So what we're ready to do now that we've got the tongue in place and the mouth shape a little bit more refined, we're ready to come in and start adding in some really nasty teeth. And so what we're going to do is start to incorporate another photographic element into our image to basically give him some really nasty, aggressive looking teeth. And so that's what we're going to focus on in the next lesson. And so we'll see you then.